Chapter 1. The Ghost of the Past. Evelyn Harper stood at the edge of her garden, her hands buried in the soft, fertile soil, though she felt no warmth from it. The chill of the October evening crept up her arms as she looked at the fading sunlight and wondered how another decade had slipped through her fingers. 10 years since she'd buried Mira. 10 years since the accident that had torn her life apart. Her husband, Daniel, called her from the doorway. "Evelyn, dinner's ready." She nodded but lingered, letting the twilight shadows stretch over her small suburban yard. Daniel had been good to her, a kind man who'd helped her pick up the shattered pieces of her life. But there were moments like this, quiet and unguarded, when the weight of her grief wrapped around her like an anchor. Inside the house, she tried to push aside the memories and focus on the mundane. The clink of silverware, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the way Daniel's voice steadied her. "I was thinking we should take a trip this Christmas," he was saying, but she barely heard him. That night, Evelyn woke to a strange restlessness. Her dreams had been sharp and vivid, filled with the sound of screeching tires and Mira's laughter. She got up and wandered to the kitchen for water. That was when she saw the silhouette outside her window, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of her yard. Her heart froze. She flicked on the porch light, and the figure darted out of view. Evelyn hurried to the door, fumbling with the lock, but when she stepped outside, there was no one there. Just the soft rustle of leaves and the cool night air pressing against her skin. The next morning, she brushed off the incident, telling herself it was nothing more than her imagination. But deep down, a familiar unease gnawed at her. By evening, it was harder to ignore the strange feeling that had settled over the house. The knock at the door came just after dinner, a slow, deliberate sound that echoed through the quiet home. Daniel was the first to the door. Evelyn followed, her heart inexplicably pounding. When Daniel swung the door open, the sight on the other side left them both speechless. A young woman stood there, her dark hair tangled from the wind and her eyes wide and searching. Evelyn's breath hitched as she took her in. Something about her was painfully familiar. "Who?" Daniel started, but the woman cut him off. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling. Her eyes locked onto Evelyn's, sharp and piercing. "It's me, Mira." Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her. "That's impossible," she whispered. But the woman stepped closer, her expression filled with a mix of anger and desperation. "I know what you did," she said, her voice low but steady. "You lied, you left me for dead, and now I'm back." Chapter 2. The Return of Shadows. Evelyn stood frozen in the doorway, her breath shallow and uneven. The young woman's words echoed in her mind. "I'm back." It couldn't be true. Mira was gone, had been gone for a decade, her life swallowed by that devastating crash. But this stranger had Mira's eyes, the same deep hazel flecked with gold, the kind of eyes you don't forget. Like Daniel finally broke the silence. "This has to be some kind of mistake," he said, his tone firm but wary. "Mira died. We buried her." "I didn't die." The woman's lips curled into a bitter smile. "But you made sure no one ever came looking for me, didn't you?" A cold sweat broke over Evelyn's skin. "What are you talking about? That's insane." Her voice trembled, though she tried to steady it. "I remember the accident," Lila said, stepping closer. "The glass shattering, the blood, and nothing. I woke up in a place where no one cared if I lived or died. You didn't even try to find me." Evelyn stumbled back, unable to process the accusation. The memories of that night were fragmented, blurred by shock and grief. The sharp turn on the wet road, the screech of tires, the smell of burning rubber, and then the silence. Terrible and absolute. "You have the wrong people," Daniel said firmly. "This is insane. You're not—" "I am Mira." Her voice was colder now, harder. She pulled back the collar of her jacket to reveal a jagged scar near her collarbone. Evelyn gasped. It was in the exact same place Mira had a scar from falling off her bike at age 6. For a moment, the room tilted. Evelyn gripped the edge of the doorframe, her pulse thundering in her ears. No one outside their family knew about that scar. "Let her in," Evelyn said quietly. "Evelyn, we don't even know who this is," Daniel hissed. "I said let her in." Reluctantly, Daniel stepped aside. Lila walked into the house like she belonged there, her gaze sweeping over the familiar surroundings with a mix of nostalgia and disdain. The living room felt stifling now, the walls pressing in on Evelyn as Lila sat on the couch, legs crossed casually like she hadn't just upended their entire world. You faked your death? Daniel demanded, his voice sharp. Lila's eyes glinted. I didn't fake anything. You're the ones who gave up on me. That's enough. Evelyn snapped. If you're really Mira, prove it. Lila tilted her head thoughtfully. You used to hide your emergency cash in the back of that picture frame. She nodded toward the framed photograph on the mantel, an old family portrait with Mira's shy smile frozen in time. Evelyn's blood ran cold. No one knew about that either. Before she could speak, Lila leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. But we both know the truth, don't we, Mom? You were driving that night, and the accident wasn't an accident at all. The room spun around Evelyn. That's a lie, she choked out. Is it? Lila's smile was razor sharp. Then why'd you make sure no one ever found the car? Evelyn's throat tightened. How could she know that? No one knew the car had been pushed into the ravine, hidden by trees and time. Daniel stood abruptly. I think you should leave. But Lila didn't budge. Oh, I'm not going anywhere, she said calmly. Not until I get what I came for. And what's that? Evelyn whispered, dread pooling in her stomach. Lila's smile faded. The truth. The tension was suffocating. Evelyn's head throbbed as fragments of that night clawed their way back to the surface. She wanted to scream that Lila was wrong, that none of this made sense. But guilt gnawed at her insides like a living thing. She had spent years burying the truth, and now it was rising from the grave. Later that night, Evelyn couldn't shake the unease creeping over her. Desperate for answers, she called the police to check the old accident report, only to discover that the entire case file had been anonymously withdrawn years ago. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Perfect Lie. Evelyn hadn't slept. The darkness of the house pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. She stood by the kitchen window, gripping a mug of untouched coffee, eyes fixed on the horizon where dawn crept in sluggishly. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the chilling revelation that had settled deep in her bones. The accident file was gone. Someone had deliberately erased it, like Mira's death had never happened. And now this girl, Lila, Mira, whoever she was back, clawing open wounds that had barely healed. Behind her, the floor creaked. She turned to find Daniel leaning against the doorway, his face drawn and tired. We need to talk, he said quietly. There's nothing to talk about, Evelyn said, though even she didn't believe it. She's lying, Daniel insisted. That girl isn't Mira. She's conning you, Evelyn. Evelyn wanted to agree, wanted to dismiss Lila as a twisted stranger, but there was that scar, the hidden cash spot, the cold certainty in her voice when she spoke of things no outsider should know. What if she's not lying? Evelyn whispered. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then she's dangerous. The weight of his words settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Lila roamed the house with unsettling familiarity, running her fingers along bookshelves, trailing her hand over furniture like she was reclaiming a stolen kingdom. Her presence made the walls of the Harper home feel smaller, suffocating. Evelyn watched her from the kitchen, unease simmering beneath her skin. You know, Lila said suddenly, turning to face her. It looks different now. What does? This house, Lila said with a faint smile. It used to be warmer, happier, before everything fell apart. Evelyn's throat tightened. If you're trying to manipulate me. Manipulate you? Lila laughed bitterly. That's funny, considering you're the one who spent the last 10 years lying to yourself. Evelyn bristled. I don't know what you think happened that night, but it wasn't what you're imagining. Oh, I know exactly what happened. Lila's eyes gleamed with something dark and dangerous. I was there, remember? The words sliced through Evelyn's composure. Her grip on the counter tightened. You said you wanted the truth. So do I. Who are you really? I told you. I'm Mira. No, Evelyn snapped. Mira is dead. I was there. She stopped herself, her voice breaking. Lila leaned forward, her expression triumphant. Go ahead, say it, admit it. I loved my daughter, Evelyn said through gritted teeth. Lila's smile didn't waver. Then why'd you kill her? That night. Evelyn couldn't stay in the same house as Lila any longer. She drove aimlessly through town, past the old playground Mira used to love, past the diner where they'd shared countless Sunday breakfasts before everything fell apart. Her memories were fractured, blurred by guilt and time. But one thing remained clear, the fight they'd had before the crash. Mira screaming at her, accusing her of caring more about work than her own family. Evelyn snapping back, blinded by frustration and exhaustion. They'd never had the chance to make things right. Her car idled near the edge of the ravine where the accident had happened. The trees loomed like silent witnesses, their gnarled branches etched against the dark sky. Evelyn's chest tightened as she stared down into the abyss where she'd lost her daughter, or thought she had. Had she really missed something that night? Had Mira somehow survived? As she sat there, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Heart pounding, she answered. You're wasting your time, a voice whispered on the other end. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Who is this? You know who. The line went dead. Daniel was waiting for her, pacing the living room. Where were you? He demanded. Out, Evelyn said, brushing past him. I needed space. You can't keep doing this, Daniel said, letting her get inside your head. She's playing you. Evelyn turned on him, fury bubbling to the surface. Then explain the scar. Explain how she knows things no one else could possibly know. Daniel's face darkened. There's always an explanation. People like her do their research. People like her? Con artists, he said bitterly. Evelyn wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her resolve. What if she's telling the truth? Daniel's jaw clenched. Then we're in a hell of a lot more trouble than you think. Later that night, Lila cornered Daniel in the hallway, her voice low and filled with menace. I know what you did, she said softly. Daniel stiffened. What are you talking about? You were there that night too, Lila whispered. And you didn't just cover it up, you made sure Mira was gone for good, didn't you? Chapter 4, Beneath the Surface. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, but it did nothing to lift the chill that hung in the air. Evelyn sat at the breakfast table, her untouched coffee growing cold. Across from her, Daniel scrolled through his phone with a furrowed brow, his usual morning routine rendered brittle by the weight of the past few days. Lila hadn't come down yet, but her presence lingered like smoke in every corner of the house. We need to call the police, Daniel said suddenly, breaking the silence. This has gone far enough. And tell them what? Evelyn asked, her voice hollow. That a girl who looks like Mira walked into our lives and knows every painful detail of our past? She shook her head. They'll think we're insane. Daniel set his phone down with a sharp clatter. You are insane if you keep letting this happen. Evelyn, she's dangerous. She wants something from us. Evelyn rubbed her temples, the ache behind her eyes relentless. Maybe she just wants the truth. Daniel's jaw clenched. We've already buried that truth, and if you're smart, you'll keep it that way. The warning in his voice was unmistakable, but Evelyn couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something huge had been hidden from her, even back then. Later that day, Evelyn decided she couldn't sit idle any longer. She had to understand how Lila knew so much, even if it meant tearing open wounds she'd spent a decade trying to forget. She started with a visit to Margaret Hines, the neighbor who had witnessed the aftermath of the accident that night. Margaret had been the one to call for help when Evelyn stumbled, bloody and shaking, onto the road after the crash. Margaret answered the door with a surprised smile. Evelyn Harper, she said warmly. It's been ages. Too long, Evelyn managed, forcing a smile. Do you have a minute? Of course, come in. Margaret's house smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish, just as Evelyn remembered. They settled into the living room where faded floral furniture stood unchanged by time. What brings you by? Margaret asked, her eyes curious but kind. Evelyn hesitated. It's about that night, the accident. Margaret's expression tightened. I thought you'd moved on from all that. So did I, Evelyn admitted. But there are things I can't stop thinking about. You said back then that you saw someone else near the scene. Do you remember? Margaret frowned thoughtfully. I told the police I saw headlights further down the road, like another car was there, but they never found anything. Evelyn's stomach twisted. Another car? Why hadn't she remembered that detail before? I always thought it was strange. Margaret continued, the way they closed the case so quickly, like they didn't want to dig too deep. That evening. Back home, Evelyn couldn't shake Margaret's words. There was someone else there that night, and they had never been found. As she rummaged through old boxes in the attic, searching for any clue she might have overlooked, her hand brushed against a familiar leather-bound journal, Mira's diary. Her breath caught as she flipped through the pages, memories flooding back with every messy scrawl. Mira had always been fiercely independent, her thoughts guarded even from her mother. But one entry, dated just a day before the accident, stopped Evelyn cold. If anything happens to me, blame Mom. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. The words blurred on the page as panic clawed at her throat. What had Mira meant? Was it just teenage angst or something more sinister? Later that night, Lila was waiting for her in the hallway, leaning casually against the wall like she owned the place. Find anything interesting? She asked, her voice dripping with amusement. Evelyn clutched the journal tightly to her chest. Stay out of my things. Lila's smile didn't waver. Funny. That's exactly what Mira used to say to you. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Who are you? She whispered. I told you, Lila said softly. I'm the girl you tried to forget. Evelyn wanted to scream, to deny everything, but the weight of the journal in her hands was undeniable proof that something had been horribly wrong even before the crash. As Evelyn stood there, trembling, Lila leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. You want to know the truth, Mom? There was another car that night, and I remember who was driving it.